More free agency moves and the owner of the PWHL in some hot water. We'll talk about that and more on today's episode of the Women's Hockey Report.
This is the Women's Hockey Report presented by Locked On NHL. Your weekly look at the world of women's hockey. From the PWHL to the international stage, it's the Women's Hockey Report on the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Welcome to another episode of the Women's Hockey Report on the Locked On NHL channel and part of the Locked On Podcast Network. We are proud to be part of a company that brings you your favorite team every single day. My name is Erica L Ayala. I am alongside Rachel Donner. Both of us cover other men's hockey teams, but once a week we get together, Rachel, to talk about the women's hockey. Before we get into today's episode, I want to let you know it's presented by our friends over at Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use promo code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. This week, we are going to once again start the show talking about free agency. We do want to talk about something that has made news a little bit outside of just the hockey realm, but involving a stakeholder in the PWHL. And then we are going to give you what is upcoming for the next several weeks on the Women's Hockey Report. And those are our team deep dives. But Rachel, let's start with free agency, still going strong. And we have several players that were signed since our last episode.
Yeah, I think the biggest one and most important one is obviously Sarah Fillier with the New York Sirens signing a 2-year extension. And to me, the fact that it's a 2-year deal is extremely important for the Sirens here. She is the star of that team, and especially with all the changes that have happened with the Sirens this offseason and other key players on that team now playing elsewhere, for the Sirens to re-sign Fillier was a huge deal. Now, she was a restricted free agent, so they did own her rights, but she could have signed a 1-year deal and bet on herself to go elsewhere, but she did sign the 2-year deal, and I think that will create some consistency. And then with all those great draft picks they made, plus remaining players, they'll be able to build around her, which I think is good.
Yeah, and although we do know that salaries are made available to the players, from what we heard from the Players Association, we don't have access to those numbers. I don't think it's hard to imagine that given some of the departures from the New York Sirens, that a 2-year deal and Sarah Fillier, coming off a fantastic season, that she was probably hopefully able to negotiate a pretty good deal there. Like you said, also opting to sign for 2 years, but not the only player that has re-upped or has signed a 2-year deal with New York.
No, Allison Simpson did as well for another 2-year deal. So I think that's good. They're just slowly but surely getting through it and putting their roster together. I think right now, there are some key players that haven't been signed overall, but there's a lot of signings happening right now that are depth signings just to lock the players in, and then the rosters are going to sort themselves out, and that's part of what we'll be talking about this, for the remainder of the off season. But I think there's a lot of players like that they're just kind of locking down.
Yeah. 100%. So we moved from the Sirens to PWHL Seattle, made a couple of moves as well.
Yeah, and I think, it may not be the most impactful on the ice, but the most impactful to the women's hockey fandom is CJ, Carly Jackson. They signed with PWHL Seattle for 1 year, and clearly going to be the third goaltender, as CJ has been, but just so excited for the content that will happen as a result.
Yeah, and I mean, I know people really lean into CJ off of the ice, and I've said this even in the PHF with the Toronto Six. That's not all you get with Carly Jackson. And if you needed more, and don't want to take my word for it as someone who covered the PHF, we saw that with Toronto.
Right.
And so, is this going to be someone that can a la, Gwyneth Phillips crack into a spot. I mean, I guess we'll see. And I don't think you lose. And I said this on Locked On Kraken, where I'm the host. You don't lose with Carly Jackson. You don't lose any ability. It's a solid goaltender that if and when you are dealing with injuries, we know again that the league overall, not specific to this position with goaltending, we don't know yet, but you have someone that can really step in, give you significant minutes, give you significant starts if and when you need to. And I personally would like to see, like what we've talked about with Minnesota. I think this is a potential for Seattle to maybe have a little bit of a different rotation, knowing that Corrine Schroeder is someone that we've talked about before. When she's on, she's on. And there are some times where she has lulls that can be, just a little bit detrimental to what the team is trying to do.
Yeah. And, I think that's a fair assessment, especially given Hannah Murphy, who isn't signed yet, recent draft pick. And, I expect Hannah Murphy to make this team, given the quality and level of goaltender she is. But, making the transition to the pro game can be challenging. And so to have somebody like CJ around, I think is a really important thing for Seattle. So I think it's a great move on their part.
Right. And maybe that doesn't necessarily rush Hannah to having to find that game if it's not there. We're not saying that. Again, great goaltender. We talked about that before. You just don't know what the transition is, but you have someone on a 1-year deal that you can, integrate. And who knows? We've seen Schroeder on the national team before. Olympics, I think, is a little bit different. And those spots, especially for Hockey Canada, are usually pretty locked up. But again, flexibility in net, I don't think hurts. But not the only move we saw from Seattle, Rachel.
No, they actually got Anna Wilgren signed, a defender. Now, is technically an extension because her rights have been traded to Seattle during the draft, but good to see that get done as well. And Wilgren, was a pretty solid contributor to Montreal this past year and had 9 points total.
Yeah, indeed. Moving on from PWHL Seattle to Ottawa, made it all the way to the final. What a final it was. We had overtimes galore, and they made some moves to solidify their roster ahead of training camp.
Yeah, I think Anna Meixner was the most prominent of the signings, just had a minimal contribution on the board, but had a solid performance, I think, overall for Ottawa, but also re-signed defenders Sam Isbell and Jessica Adolfson, and then got that depth goaltender in Logan Angers.
Indeed. All right, we want to move from Ottawa to Minnesota. They had just one signing, but multi-year deal.
Yeah, and signing Kendall Cooper was, I think, obviously a really important thing for the Frost. That was their top draft pick this year, and one of the few draft picks that have been signed thus far, or one of the few key draft picks that have been signed thus far. And so it's good to see the Frost lock her down again, especially I think the Frost are one of the couple of teams with the biggest changes to their roster this upcoming season in terms of losing key pieces. And so I think, Kendall Cooper is going to be a big part of this upcoming season for that team.
Indeed. And at the time of our recording, this will wrap up our signings between episodes. Montreal, Caitlin Willoughby, 1-year extension.
Yep. And, again, we're just like locking these contracts down. So we go into camp, like knowing who the options are.
Yeah. And I think that's solid. I think most teams will probably take the approach that Kara told you she's taking with Vancouver. Like, nothing's locked in stone. Want people to come into training camp, want people to come into whatever preseason may exist, and see how everything meshes and gels. But we do have, again, just some players that have been able to solidify how long, or the term, I guess, of their contract, figure that out, and then we'll move forward. But I'm sure there will be more signings to come. We still have more players that were selected through the draft that we haven't heard about yet. And I would imagine that not all of them, Rachel, but a decent amount of those players will be offered contracts before we get to training camp. Before we move on to our next segment, also want to give some stick taps out to Haley Moore. I got to work with Haley a lot in the NWHL/PHF. She most recently was the executive vice president of the American Hockey League, the AHL, but is now moving in a different direction, which may, mean that she's getting a little bit closer to the women's side of hockey.
Yeah, so she's going to move over to work in player representation for Cortex, which is an agency. They do many things, but they do represent a whole slew of PWHL players, including Hannah Brandt, Michaela Cava, Jessie Eldridge, Julia Gosling, Nicole Hensley, Savannah Harmon, and a whole bunch more. So, she's getting back into the women's game. So that's exciting to see.
Yeah, Haley Moore, such a force. Loved seeing her growth path and potential, and curious what this will look like, as now there is a league that I think a lot of people outside of hockey are seeing as solid, and there are ways that you can move in business that we're growing, but have maybe a little bit more of a landscape. So I think agents and player representation is a part of that. So love to see it grow, especially if it has a solid impact on what the players are able to do as far as their earnings with their contracts, and even outside of their contracts with things like name, image, likeness, sponsorship, etc. So very curious to see how that goes. But coming up next, we're going to tackle something that, again, will take us off of the ice, literally, but we'll talk about another ice and what's been happening and how that's been impacting what's happening in communities, how it impacts politically, and how this is tied to the business of Mark Walter, who, of course, is associated with the PWHL.
Have you ever decided at the last minute to head to a ball game with friends or family? Maybe it's game day and you suddenly realize you want to be in the stands. That's exactly where Game Time comes in. It's the easiest way to grab last minute tickets without the stress. With the money you save on tickets, you can splurge on food, drinks, merch, or even invite a bigger group of friends to come with you. Game Time makes it possible. And buying tickets is so fast and simple. Prices on the app actually drop the closer you get to first pitch. They've got incredible last minute deals, clear seat views, and a lowest price guarantee that takes the worry out of buying. Game Time is the official ticketing partner of Locked On MLB, making it easy to browse the app for exciting upcoming Major League Baseball games. And if you're a Philadelphia fan like me, the next Phillies home series starts July 18th versus the Angels. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, use the code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem with the code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off. Download the Game Time app today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guarantee.
All right. Thanks as always for making Locked On NHL. Let me do that again. Thanks for making Locked On, and specifically the Women's Hockey Report, part of your daily destination, your first listen of the day on a Saturday, because we like to get this episode up for you nice and early so you have the whole day to listen. Rachel and I talking about the signings. We just went through that. But now we have to, again, talk a little bit about the ownership group. And I just want to preface by saying there have been ownership conflicts or potential conflicts that have been brought up up in previous leagues, including potential partnerships with outlets, sports media outlets that seemed to not align with the general culture and vibe of women's hockey in the past. And so that's why we wanted to mention this. Mark Walter, who is a part of course, the PWHL and is known in other circles for his ownership stakes in places or organizations like the Los Angeles Dodgers, the LA Sparks, Chelsea of the EPL, most recently the Lakers. Mark Walter is also the CEO, though, of Guggenheim Partners, which is a financial firm that manages over $325 billion in assets, and they hold a 0.38% stake in GEO Group, Rachel, which is a private prison corporation that operates U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, detention centers. And ICE detention centers, Rachel, have been in the news a lot for a lot of different reasons. And, again, I think that given what the overall sentiment around women's, hold on one second. No, not today. Thank you. That's okay. I didn't get a privacy thing for my hotel and I forgot to ask for one. So I'm sorry. So, given, again, Rachel, the culture overall of women's sports, I think we could definitely make a case for differentiating perhaps on this topic when it comes to women's ice hockey. But generally speaking, the women's sports community is very accepting, and that seems to be at or within tension on what's happening when it comes to immigration enforcement and how ICE is operating, which is in a lot of ways, not always, but in a lot of ways, an unprecedented use of force.
Yeah, I think, obviously we know with the Dodgers, there's been a lot of protest around that. And, there was thought that Dodger Stadium grounds were being used as a staging area for ICE operations. And so I think that, when we bring up a topic like this, it's not that, you're trying to make things political. It is political, and sports are political inherently. Yeah. And that's a baseline assumption that, I'm going to speak for you a little bit here, but it's a baseline assumption that I think both of us have. And sports has been made political, and this organization has been a big part of it here, right? Mark Walter and his role as Dodgers principal owner has been very political in this issue. And so when you take that and the fact that he's the principal owner of the PWHL, you kind of have to overlay the topic there, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, 100%. And I think it's been something that I've talked about in circles where it's like, because of the ramp up when it comes to engaging ICE agents and officers at even checkpoints where people who are citizens, I'm going to specifically talk about North America, but now there are people wondering, and in some places we've already seen people are being subject to checkpoints more than usual. And the thing, at least in the United States, is that we are able to and are supposed to be given due process. However, there have been cases where even those things have been that they have not been honored. And so I will be honest, as someone who is a citizen, as someone who travels a lot and I always carry my passport card because it's just easier. I learned this hack actually from a flight attendant, where I'm like, if I have to offer an ID, I'd rather offer one that doesn't have an address, like a physical home address on it when I can. So that's why I started carrying my passport card, just as someone who travels a lot. But now I carry it for a whole different reason. I mean, I have brown skin. I have a name that can be associated to many different countries, and that shouldn't, in theory, matter. because I can very much prove that I'm a US citizen. And if I'm going to be under scrutiny that I've never experienced before, I will be honest, sometimes that makes me think, and why does that relate to a league, a women's hockey league, even outside of ownership, is because these are athletes now that are crossing borders. And
Yep.
the North American border, again, we're seeing more checkpoints, and people are being asked and subject to even turning over their smartphones and their other electronic devices. I mean, is that something sometimes you can say, oh, well, athletes won't have to do that, but we've also not seen that be the case already. I think it was a Sudanese women's basketball team that wasn't honored and given visas for exhibition games. We have the World Cup coming up. We have some of the pre-World Cup games that are already happening. I mean, there's a lot to consider here, I think.
Yeah, and you say, oh, Guggenheim has a 0.38% stake in the company that runs these private prisons, right? Mm-hmm. You're like, that's nothing. But you look in an article by Stacey Brown, she did the math, that adds up to $12 million invested in that company. Well, let's look at the salary cap of the PWHL, right? So for this upcoming season, it's about like 1.35 million per team. So that's basically more than the entire salary cap of the PWHL invested in ICE detention centers. And so when you compare it like that is a big deal to me. And I think the other big deal to me is this new partnership that they've announced with Palantir Technologies, which is this data analytics company. And they have created software called Immigration OS that uses facial recognition and algorithms and data analytics to track immigrants and to basically hunt them down. And like that is a tough pill to swallow, to be a fan of women's pro hockey if you care about such things.
Yeah, and I think we've seen facial recognition integrated in so many ways, and it's like, you go to an airport, or in some places, right, you can use Clear to enter stadiums, and you're like, oh, picture, not a big deal. But when these types of business deals are being made, maybe it is a bigger deal, and maybe it's something you want to think about. And we're not encouraged. I remember being at an airport, and I was like, why are you taking my photo again? And they're like, you just have to do it. And I'm like, what? I don't understand why. And they were like, I'm like, but I'm giving you a physical, and I got made to feel as though I had to do that. This was several years ago, mind you. A whole different administration was in office, if we want to make that connection. But I think the point that I'm making is that I know now that what I was asked to do several years ago was, no, I didn't have to. You don't have to do, some of that. And this facial recognition technology, how it's being utilized, can be harmful, or at the least, which, I don't think is minimal, but it can be an invasion of people's privacy that they don't choose to engage in if they know they have a choice not to engage. And so again, how does this interact in sports, whether it's specifically the PWHL or beyond? Again, Mark Walter has ownership stakes in other places. I can't speak to what the game day experience is as far as the use of this technology. Does it overlap at all? I'm not.
Will it be used in arenas that the PWHL plays in, and be used to potentially identify immigrants?
That's exactly, like, do we know this? I'll speak for me. I don't know for sure if that's what's happening. However, given what you've just said and breaking it down, the percentage versus the investment in women's ice hockey, it's not nothing. And, a 0.38% investment is still, if the company and the technology, the detention centers that you're investing in, and the technology that you're investing in, if it is being used more and more, 0.38 still goes up like full 1% and beyond investments. I mean, it's still a way that the Mark Walter Group is making money off of things that at minimum, again, and I'm not trying to minimize this, but within the context of what we're talking about, at minimum, that people just don't want to opt into, but can be at the max very harmful, again, to immigrant communities, or even not, because again, due process is something that seems to be up in question at this point.
And I would say, is it something that would prevent fans of women's hockey from attending games?
Yeah.
And I don't like that either.
Yeah.
I think it gives people pause to say, should I attend a PWHL game if it's going to put me or my family at risk?
Yeah, I mean, all really interesting questions, and why we wanted to bring it up, because these are conversations that are happening in sports elsewhere. I think the World Cup is the biggest thing up and coming. We've already seen media outlets having VIP events, have ICE on board, or board, excuse me, one of their VIP events prior to some of the events that have been happening in Miami. This is a media outlet hosting an event that presumably was targeted among all of the other media events having VIP events that day, because it was a Telemundo event, which is Spanish-speaking media. Yeah. So I don't know. Again, something that we'll have to see if and how this story develops, and specifically relates to the PWHL and the PWHL experience in arena. But it is definitely something that, again, the Mark Walter Group, namesake of the Walter Cup, is involved in. So wanted to bring that up, and we'll just kind of keep our finger on the pulse. And I'd be curious to see if and how athletes, and certainly fans, react to this association, which, again, there have been other ownership groups in the past that have had their associations, their business associations, questioned because of especially the culture around women's sports, it being inclusive, it being about equity, it being about empowerment. And when things like this maybe come at a dangerous intersection to some of the community, I think it's worth having a conversation. So we'll keep up with the story if and how it develops. But moving on, we want to let you know what you can expect here for the next several weeks on the Women's Hockey Report. We'll get into that coming up. All right, Rachel, I had to put on my poli-sci hat for that last segment. Between that,
same.
I mean, between that and the indictment of the CEO of the Oakview Group over on Locked on Kraken, like I'm definitely getting my legalese on, Good grief. Yeah. But that's it, strange bedfellows in business, I suppose. And yes, they do intersect with sports. And I appreciate having a co-host that's willing to have that conversation with me. So thank you for that. Yeah. But we're going to have different types of conversations in the coming weeks. And we're going to do team deep dives. This was actually something that Rachel was recommended in the YouTube comments. And we talked about it and we were like, yeah, we should absolutely do that. So we're going to do this for all 8 teams. Now, we've already done a little bit of this homework, so to speak, Rachel, for Seattle and Vancouver. But again, there are new signings as we inch closer to training camp, so I'm sure we'll be able to re-up that. But first, let's talk about the order, Rachel, that we're gonna do these in. So who will be the first team up on the block for one of our deep dives?
Yeah, we're going to go in reverse order from champion to first eliminated here. So we're going to start with the two-time defending champ, Minnesota Frost. And we're going to kind of approach each team looking at, okay, who did they lose this past offseason with the expansion draft and free agency? Who have they added to their roster? Including the draft picks, and kind of look at who may or may not make the cut there. We're going to look at potential lineup with lines and expectations going into the new season.
Yeah, I'm excited for this because I think, again, there will be news. We don't know how often the news will come in, but there will be news.
Or like a schedule, maybe.
Yeah, like a schedule. A schedule would be great. We actually, speaking of Haley Moore, we spoke about her earlier. I'm pretty sure I have the AHL schedule. The Coachella Valley schedule has come out. So
We do not have an NHL schedule yet either.
We don't have an NHL schedule. We don't have a PWHL schedule yet. I'm sure the two are related, at least in the case of some teams like a Seattle, for example. So we'll have to see about that. But yes, we'll break all of these things down. But also, I think this is a great chance. If you are listening, again, thank you to our everydayers or every Saturdayers. We appreciate you chiming in and commenting. If there are other things, whether it's for all of the 8 teams or team specific, that you would like to hear us talk about or hear us address, let us know in the chat and we'll re-up this every time we talk. So again, for the Minnesota Frost fans, you are first up. This is your chance. This is your time. Let us know what you want to hear about. We know you are definitely going to hold us feet to the coals when we don't dive into Minnesota enough, and we hear you and you listen. We want to make sure that we do it right. So if there are any things that you have, we definitely have had Lee Steckline on the show. Kendall Coyne Schofield was technically talking about the PA, but also some Minnesota Frost representation there. So we want to make sure we get it right. And I think big question for everyone, right, is a three-peat is it possible? I feel like that's got to be a question, right?
Yeah, I think so for sure.
Yeah. So we want to have fun with this. And hopefully, again, this will be something that you can enjoy. If and when we have news that's specific to these teams, or we can find people to tap in and either join us, or we can recap conversations that we've had, we will definitely do that. But that's what it's going to look like for the next effective 8 shows, right, Rachel? Unless some big news comes, this is what we're going to do. And so hopefully you will continue to join us here on the Women's Hockey Report. But I mean, yeah, we are deep into the off season now, whether it's men's hockey or women's hockey. So this is all about the shoulda, coulda, wouldas, but also projecting what's going to happen.
Yeah. And in the meantime, if you want to get your fix for some women's hockey over the summer, there are 2 women's teams in the Beauty League in Minnesota. And, there's definitely some PWHLers on those rosters. So take a look. They do stream their games if you are not in Minnesota directly to see them. But they've got 2 different teams under Tradition Capital Bank. All the teams are like sponsor names.
Yeah.
But, we've got Maddie Rooney is playing, Grace Zumwinkle is playing, so's her sister Emily. Izzy Daniel, Kelly Panic is in that league. And Taylor Heisey is playing, obviously, for Minnesota, right? So there's so many other players there, so you can get your fix at the Beauty League.
I love it. Also, if you're not already following Blake Bolden, you definitely should, for so many reasons, including that Blake Bolden is putting together a roller hockey event, and it's a fundraiser event. And she and a few, again, former pros, current pros have been doing roller hockey tournaments in LA for several summers now. But this one specific is to raise funds for some hockey programs on the continent of Africa, if I'm not mistaken. So that's going to be a good one. Also, since we are promoting summer hockey, I have to tell you that next month is the Amerigol LATAM Cup, and yours truly will once again be one of the broadcasters. We usually are broadcasting on Flow Hockey. It is for free. It's so much fun. Teams from Greece and Cuba, and we've had Israel, we've had Egypt, Colombia, Argentina usually has really good teams, so that's a lot of fun. But we can talk about that as we get closer. But for Rachel Donner, Erica L. Ayala, thank you again for tapping into the Women's Hockey Report. Especially if you're a Minnesota Frost fan, let us know in the chat what you want to see and hear us talk about on the next episode, which will be our first in our deep dive series. Be kind to yourselves and be kind to others, as I always say on the Locked on Kraken show, and we will catch you on next week's episode. Peace out, everybody.